Hello, and welcome to Life's Dirty Little Secrets. I'm Chris McCurry.
And I'm Emma Waddington. And today we're going to talk to you all about our year at Life's Dirty Little Secrets. And sort of as we were looking back at 2025, we noticed something quite surprising, that we keep landing on the same uncomfortable truths. The first one is that the harder we try to fix ourselves, the more stuck we get. And honestly, as I was listening to our conversation that we had with Alex Pang about rest, I realized that it really is very difficult for me to rest. And despite having listened to his podcast, despite having had conversations about, thriving versus striving, and knowing that, rest is more productive than grinding, I still struggle. I feel like my to-do list is inviting me all the time and that I can't rest until I finish it, until everything is done. And it feels like a real trap. Despite knowing it, I can see how it keeps going. And now, with the end of the year, conversations about holidays and plans, my to-do list is just bulging with demands and expectations. And it feels like rest is even further away.
And also, what was interesting for me about that conversation was how he defined rest. And it's not necessarily taking a nap. That the research shows that what's most restorative can be other activities, things that are, quite different from what we think of as our work, perhaps, but are nonetheless energetic even, or certainly get us focused in a different direction. And we can listen to some samples of that podcast in a moment. But it reminds me of that story, allegory, whatever you want to call it, where the man is walking through the forest and he comes upon somebody who's got a big saw and he's sawing down a tree. And he looks very tired and sweaty. And the traveler in the forest says, "Hey, you look pretty exhausted. Why don't you, and the saw looks pretty dull because you've been working for a while. Why don't you take a break and sharpen the saw and then get something to drink and go back at it?" And the guy says, "No, can't do that. Got to saw down this tree." And he keeps sawing with the saw that's getting more and more dull, and he's getting more and more tired. And the idea there, too, is you got to take a break sometimes and sharpen the saw. And that could be working in the garden, or it could be, for me, it's grabbing my guitar and, playing a few chords and then getting back to whatever it is I'm doing.
Yes, I love that metaphor. And it is, I think for me, it's just very humbling to realize that no matter how much we know, this continues to be hard. Like, we've had so many of these conversations this year around toxic striving. We had a great conversation about burnout too. That is that relentless stress that's so dangerous. And yet it sort of calls us, doesn't it? Because we do live in communities that, like you were just saying about Atlanta having a hustle culture, we do live in communities that keep inviting us to do more, to be more. And the invitation is always there to do more and be more. That will never go. And so what I've learned from these conversations this year is that I need to take charge a bit more of the way I want my life to be, and to have permission, because like you said, rest has actually helped me in many ways. Like, it's not just about not doing the work when we rest. It's actually also doing some other really important things, and taking that time out of work can help us do better work. But it also can help us feel better about our lives, because Alex was talking about, rest being engaging in this deliberate activity that actually is quite meaningful.
It turns out that the most restorative kinds of rest are not always passive. So the idea of rest as something that's active is, I think, an important thing for all of us to understand. They are things like taking walks, doing stuff in the garden, things that sometimes involve a mix of physical exertion and some mental exertion or challenge that's different from work, that takes your mind off of your work or your troubles. So think of rest as the time that we spend rebuilding or recharging the mental and physical batteries that we spend down when we're working or being a parent or such.
And it sort of aligns with some of the stuff that we heard with our conversation with Debbie on burnout, that, what burnout helps us really understand is all the things we're missing from our lives, all the things that gave us value that have been dropped in the service of doing more work or more parenting or whatever else we're sort of stuck in, is what we need to recover.
We end up with a very narrow definition of ourselves that is not restorative.
Yeah. And a very narrow definition of success too.
Yes, definitely.
Like as if, it's only when we finish our to-do list that we will feel like we've done a good enough job. Or that conversation we had about toxic striving was very powerful. And Paula sort of spoke about, how everything has become striving, right? We can't even just sleep. We've got to optimize our sleep. Everything has been touched with this performance enhancement narrative, which just means that it can feel really relentless and not a lot of permission just to do things and to savor them and to walk slowly, to move through the world.
Right. And burnout can be a badge of honor.
Yeah.
I mean, one of the very first books on burnout is called The Cost of Caring. So, it's like, I care, so I care, therefore I'm burned out. And
that's right.
And if I'm not burned out, then maybe that means I don't care. And I don't want anybody to think I don't care.
Exactly. I think we're stuck with that. We talked about burnout in parenting as well. I think we can easily get stuck with that in parenting, can't we? Like if we didn't, and at the moment, I mean, I don't know what it was like, but at the moment, being a parent, I know we parent more than we ever have. We work more than we ever have. And, it's an impossible equation to do both, to the extent that we're expected to. But I do find there are a lot of demands from school around, being there for activities, supporting with homework, extracurricular activity. I mean, there's a lot. And there's expectation that we're super involved in it all. And perhaps the expectation on the kids is unrealistic, which means that parents need to step in, which sort of keeps us trapped in this. Like you're saying, like if I care about my kid, I'm not going to let him fail. But we're sort of trying to solve the wrong problem. The reality is that it's probably not realistic for my kid to do that level.
In my clinical practice, I saw a lot of families where the high school student was taking, 4 advanced placement classes and 2 sports and something else. And it was all in the service of getting into that, top-end university. But it was killing the whole family.
Yeah.
So the pressure is floating down and affecting our kids too. So
that's right.
It is definitely toxic striving.
Yeah. So I think that the wisdom is that we need to know how to rest and how to really think about where to put our energy, a bit like Diana Hill's. I love her book and her work around wise effort, right? Really seeing the wisdom on where we put our effort, and that the invitation to do more is always going to be there. But how is it really working out for us?
Right. And to give ourselves permission to not do more.
And we might do better as a result, like with Alex's, conversation on deliberate practice, that actually taking rest from this high intense activities is really good for us on many levels. Awesome. So that's the first paradox. The second paradox we came up with is this paradox of the more we avoid our feelings, the stronger they become. That was another theme this year, which is obviously very aligned with our acceptance and commitment therapy work. And, we had a few conversations that seemed to circle back to this truth. The feeling we push away becomes the thing ruining our lives. And the vulnerability that is often the feeling that's behind that initial feeling. And that's the thing we avoid most. But that's where we want to be going more. So our conversation with Russell Kolts on anger, we realized really that, often anger, I remember his quote, is a great signal.
But a bad strategy.
but a bad strategy. I love that. I've used that a lot since.
One thing I'll say is anger is really good at alerting us to stuff that's not okay, right?
Yeah.
Stuff that crosses our values or stuff we're not all right with. And that sort of cueing us that maybe I want to do something about this now. Maybe I want to say something about this now. And so if we can use some of that energy to provoke us to think, okay, what would be a functional way for me to work with this thing that's activated my anger?
It's a great signal. It's intense. It's ferocious. It calls us into action.
It's the idea of repurposing these difficult emotions to see them as allies, as something we need to pay attention to, listen to, as opposed to something we need to fight with or get rid of.
And that they're messengers, right? I remember our conversation with Ross White. He talked about, treat emotions as messengers, that they're messengers. They're telling us something, but they won't necessarily be telling us what to do. They're just telling us that something's up. And I think that's particularly powerful with anger, right? Because anger can really propel us into action. But often that action has far greater consequences than we necessarily want.
Right. So it has to be handled well.
Well, James Cordova said about connection. Yeah, he was talking about that anger, right? That in relationships, often we walk around like little porcupines, pricking each other and upsetting each other, and that anger will come up first, right? And it's very hard when we're met with anger not to respond with anger.
They called it getting quilled.
So the idea of the porcupine's dilemma is that we're all porcupines, and we're like porcupines in love. Right? Like we want to be close to each other. We want to get in there and snuggle and have that sort of warmth and sort of mammalian connection. But we're also covered in quills. So, you get in close enough, it is inescapable. It is absolutely guaranteed that you're going to catch quills on a relatively regular basis. So it's one of those, it's an aphorism, right? Like you hurt the people that you love, right? Like the people that you are most vulnerably exposed to are the people that are going to sting you. They're going to quill you the most frequently, usually by accident, usually inadvertently, just in a grumpy mood, not necessarily meaning to take it out on you. And of course, similarly, the people that are most vulnerably exposed to you are the people that you're going to sting and hurt and quill the most frequently. So the dilemma is we're trying to get in there and be close and cuddly, but we're also having to navigate that is inescapably painful territory.
Yeah, turning and facing the anger of abandonment as it might be in a relationship issue. Yeah, those are hard moves to make.
Really hard. Joe Oliver used to call them Jedi skills, which I always thought was really apt.
It may get easier with time and experience, but that initial turning toward is always, I think, going to be very aversive. And if we have an experience of that working for us in a relationship, particularly, or just anything we're trying to accomplish, I think we can use that next time to motivate ourselves to go ahead and take that plunge.
It's so true, isn't it? The bottom line is that often what hurts is what truly matters, right? If we're longing for, when we are in relationships, be it friendships, be it, partnerships, even at work, right? We, the kind of monkey we are is a monkey that wants to be connected and wants to belong. And we had that great conversation around belonging with Meg McKelvey. And, the idea of not belonging is terrifying. The idea of being rejected is terrifying. And those micro moments, those small interactions where there is this micro rejection, this micro, disconnect can feel incredibly painful. And I believe there's studies that have shown that in sort of MRIs, when we have that moment, it actually activates the part of the brain that feel pain, like it's physical. And that's why often, we respond to it like a dragon because it's just so upsetting. but the response itself often perpetuates the problem and leads to more disconnect. But if we start to have that wisdom and that realization that, I'm getting really angry here, let's be curious, why has this upset me so much? And we can reach through our dragon and actually speak from that place of fear, then it'll be easier for us in the long run, even though it is, like we call the Jedi skill, it's a very difficult thing to do in the moment when you're feeling so activated and so triggered. And it's so very human. And we saw it in that conversation with Kurt as well around moral outrage, that when we are activated, when something has been said that has really outraged us, there is this righteousness that happens, right? We feel righteous. We feel better than. We feel superior. But that creates a lot of disconnection in communities, but also in families, in our relationships, that just perpetuates a feeling of isolation, which is ultimately what we don't want.
There's a self-protective feature to that righteous anger. It puts up a wall.
Conflict is just all around us. I have a colleague, John Saruf, and he says conflict flattens people. You take the richness of others, their humanity, and you flatten them. And my work reveals that we flatten them in a very particular way, and that is we see them as perpetrators. And we often see ourselves as victims of their wrongness. So in couples, it's exactly the case, right? You always do this. You're thoughtless, you're hurting me, and I'm just trying to live my life, and all I do is feel pain because of your terrible actions. And so the flattening is really about perpetrator versus victim, and it's always us or our preferred side that's the victim. And the reason that we flatten people in this way is because our feelings of pain or fear are so obvious to us, right? Because they're in our own minds. But the feelings of fear or pain that people on the other side, right, our spouse, for instance, or people on the other side of the aisle might be feeling, it's harder for us to understand, right? We have to work and overcome our own feelings of fear or victimhood to really appreciate that they might be feeling the same way. And it's that kind of deep asymmetry in like our own fear versus that of others that entrenches our views of I'm the victim and you're the perpetrator, and I refuse to think otherwise.
Yeah. Boy, does it feel good though, doesn't it? It feels so good to be righteous.
That's one of my favorite feelings.
I know, I agree.
Particularly when I'm driving.
So I think that's important too, right? When we're feeling righteous, even though we're sort of pushing away from our partner, pushing away from our child, our colleague at work, the other driver, whatever it is, it feels so good in the brain. Is it like a sense of safety, but it's a sense of being better than?
Well, it's almost personal experience is less a feeling of safety and more not feeling unsafe.
Yeah, that's right.
As Russell Kolts talks about this when he talks about compassion-focused therapy, systems that we have, the threat system, fight or flight, the nurturing system, and then what he calls the safeness system, which is different from, he makes a distinction between safeness and safety. And he says that, the guy on his front porch with the rifle, ready for anybody that tries to rob him, that's safety. But safeness is a much more calm, comforting, affirming kind of place to be. It's not that tight kind of feeling that the guy on the porch with his rifle, is experiencing. And he may feel safe, but he's certainly not feeling good about his situation.
Yeah, I love that. What we're talking about, the sort of safety is the urge, right? When we get triggered in relationships with others, the urge is to create that sense of safety, either from that place of, righteousness, fighting threat.
And safeness is more akin to and I'm not doing justice to these three different systems, but the system that is creating closeness and, and each of these have different neurochemicals associated with them. And, the oxytocin that's associated with connection and safeness it's just a different state, one of community and connection and vulnerability too, which seems odd that you would equate safeness with vulnerability, but it's the ability to feel vulnerable and feel safe. It's sort of like the definition of a holding environment from the work of Winnicott and some of the other folks that parents provide, where they're creating a holding environment where things are scary but safe, where your child can be, upset in some way, angry, anxious, sad, and the parent is providing that context in which that's okay. You can feel that, and it's not the end of the world, and the child learns that they can tolerate, they can feel difficult stuff. And it's not the end of the world. They don't have to try to get rid of those feelings, act them out in some way that's going to be maladaptive. They're all kind of interconnected.
And I guess that's what we're seeking in relationships, is that place, that holding space too. When we get that sense of safeness, which is what we're asking for many times, where we can be ourselves and we can be vulnerable, it does lead to connection, which is so good for our brains and so good for our hearts. But it requires us to take a risk, right? In the relationship.
Sure, at least, initially, certainly, are you the person that I can trust to, allow me to be who I am in all my vulnerabilities and all my foibles and all that sort of thing? And if you are, then I'm going to stick with you. I don't get this very often in life. And we have to cherish and take care of those people in our lives. And hopefully give them what they're giving us in terms of the ability to be who they are and have that be not just okay, but even, value them.
That's right. And that sort of brings us on to the third paradox that we talked about more recently with Lakeysha Hallmon, this self-made myth. And this idea that, and perhaps this is one of the most dangerous paradoxes, is that we have to do it alone and go it alone. That's the way that you're more likely to be successful. And that individualistic sort of narrative kind of keeps us in that space where we're feeling under threat because you see others as competition and not your community. And from, what you were describing, it reminded me of this place of wanting to connect with others versus fight others. In your relationship, obviously, it feels like, something that we're doing day in, day out is, either pushing or pulling our partners away. But I think we do it in our communities as well. And, we're everywhere really, is we're kind of testing to see if those around us are really going to support us or not. And this idea that we're self-made goes against what we really need. We need community. Lakeysha talked about being village made. I love that, really recognizing that it takes a village to build us, that we can't go it alone. That's not how we're wired. We're not wired to do things alone. We have a loneliness epidemic. People are feeling incredibly lonely, even in very built up cities. In fact, I don't know what the data shows, but I wonder if in the villages, people are feeling less alone than in the big cities because there is more of a community. But having a community is hard. It means you bump up against other humans who do things that you don't like, who say things you don't like, who perhaps smell in ways you don't appreciate. There's just being amongst humans brings up lots of challenging emotions. And I feel the invitation is to recognize that we need community. It's really important for us. It makes us feel good. It makes us really flourish. And we need to learn how to build our village and our community because it isn't always idyllic, right? It means sometimes you have to have the hard conversations. Sometimes you have to hear stuff that you don't like and you don't agree with, and you'll feel righteous. And so there's a lot to be doing as we're building our village and working in our communities, and a lot to be feeling.
Yeah, it is a lot of work, and anybody who's served on some kind of board knows how fraught this could be when everybody presumably has the same, goals, the same agenda, but people being people, and it gets messy. and
Yes.
we have to do the give and take. And I think it's also just recognizing that the village is really the norm, that, we all have come up through societies of bigger and smaller, starting with the family and, the education that we got, for better or for worse, where we work. I mean, I suppose there are people who can avoid people quite well through, their occupation or where they live, something like that. But, I heard a story once about some hermit who lived on the hillside, mountaintop above a village down below in the valley, and he never had anything to do with the village down below. And one year a big flood came along and wiped out most of the village, and all the villagers moved away. And so the hermit moved to a different hut on a different mountain above a different village and didn't have anything to do with those people either. So, we all need connection, even if it's to claim we don't have a connection.
Interesting. It is so true. And I do think it's a real muscle, like the conversation we had on conflict resilience, where we spoke about, the fact that communities are becoming more polarized, and we are finding it harder and harder to sit with others who see things differently. And Bob Bordone was talking about how he thinks that, partly we blame everything on social media, but the fact that we no longer watch TV the way we used to, where you had your 4 channels and you had to listen to the perspective of these, 4 different viewpoints, versus today, we sort of live in these echo chambers where we just listen to our version of reality. And so we get less and less exposed to the feelings, the uncomfortable feelings that come with having somebody say something that you don't agree with. And they talked about how we need to get back into the place where we're sitting with others who have different perspectives. If we need to solve some of the hardest problems that, our world faces, is that we need to come together and listen more and really get better at listening to hard things that we don't agree with. And there really is a muscle that we need to keep working at, because you lose it. You lose that ability.
Right. It circles back to the idea of trying to avoid feelings you don't like. And we're trying to be comfortable all the time. Comfort is great, and it doesn't often get us where we need to go. Between here and there, some important goal, there's probably some discomfort that we have to feel and be willing to feel, even if we don't want to.
That's right.
And that is a muscle that can get better with experience. Again, that initial turning toward is going to feel awful. And if we have a narrative, a story to tell ourselves about, why it's important that we take that leap of faith, why we turn into the wind, we can do it more and feel more successful in doing so.
Yes. So it is practice. And I think the recognition that, being human, when we're building, these communities, when we're doing the stuff that's really important to us, we're going to bump up against some hard feelings that we have about others. And it doesn't mean that you should be with other people that, don't care for you, don't treat you well.
Right. We're not talking about being abused.
Exactly. We really are not. Although sometimes some of us find it really hard to recognize that. But we're talking about, sitting with, being with, making room for some of the hard feelings in the service of being with others, creating communities, building bridges. That feels really good. So our final paradox is fighting what we can't change. And we sort of had a group of conversations where we realized that the more we fight our feelings, our situation, our life circumstances, the more we suffer. And these were some of our most popular conversations, actually. So we had a conversation on chronic pain. We had a conversation on the new normal, or there's no normal, with Steve Hayes. And then the conversation we had with living with death. They were the most popular. And I think it's because it's a realization that part of our human condition is living with some really hard experiences, like, the loss of someone we love, or the fact that, we're all going to die, and that living with physical pain or chronic illness, if we treat them as problems to fix, our life actually gets smaller and smaller.
Yeah, it's tricky. I mean, discerning what's changeable and what's not is very tricky. And again, going back to the idea of we don't want people to be abused. We're certainly not saying that I'm in an abusive relationship, I guess I can't change that. Well, you certainly could change that and probably should change that. But some things are just, we're just stuck with, if not permanently, at least temporary, in terms of, and I think chronic pain is the perfect example of that. For a lot of people, sadly, they live with conditions make it difficult for them to get around, and they have to accommodate to that and not let it shrink their life down to the point where they're no longer feeling vital.
Yeah.
But that's a hard sell for people who are experiencing, whether it's chronic pain or some mental health conditions that are just very chronic and can be debilitating. People with biologically based depression symptoms or other things that plague them, and they have to cope with that and to make room for it in a way that allows them to see past it and to do what they need to do. That's very tricky. And the whole
really
death thing, we had a great conversation about that. And the paradox, or maybe these are ironies, and it depends as well as paradoxes, is that, meeting our death and, can, in the way of thinking about it, recognizing it, honoring it, even can make our lives more vital, because it's like, I don't have time to mess around, particularly at my age. I got a lot more years behind me than I do in front of me. And so what am I doing with it?
That was a really poignant exercise that we did with Robin on the episode on living with death. So I would recommend. Yeah, that timeline. It was.
Yeah. When I put my line on that timeline, was shocking to me. It's like, wow. And for any of us, sadly, people leave for work in the morning and don't come home.
And there is that invitation there. I think it was Manuela on the conversation talked about, it being like the meditation bell, that reminder to keep bringing us back to what matters.
A good reminder that helped me, reminding in Spanish is recordar, and the Latin meaning of it is go back to your heart. So that can remind us, recordar, help us to come back to our heart and realize the possibility to choose, that it's not the mandatory rule to do, but the possibility to choose to live on the edge of each moment. We have been presenting with roaming as a way of creating a meaningful life, moment by moment, step by step, not in big things, but in the small way of living.
Yeah, and not to be morbid about it or cynical about it, but just to recognize that we're not going to be around forever, and even the idea of being around forever sounds kind of boring.
Yeah, what would that look like? Like, how would that change the way that we live our lives?
I'd be even worse at procrastinating than I am now.
That's right. Oh, yes. And then the conversation we'd had with Steve Hayes, real invitation to stop trying to figure out what's normal, what's not normal. That permission to be who we are and to live life the way that brings us the most meaning.
And to not put other people into boxes.
Yeah, which is, including ourselves, as the one who can't ... or as the one who only ... That actually we're far more complicated than that.
Right. And far more individual than that. My wife works with people with dementia, early onset schizophrenia, all the different kinds of dementia that she talks about. In the saying in the world of Alzheimer's research and clinical work is, if you've met one person with Alzheimer's, you've met one person with Alzheimer's.
Right,
because it's so varied. And it's the same with schizophrenia and some of these other things. Yeah, there are over 600,000 different combinations of symptoms out of the diagnostic manual, all of which meet full criteria for post-traumatic stress disorder. You can have over 600,000 different presentations of post-traumatic stress disorder. So all of these things, are very nuanced and individualized, and they have to be approached as such.
That's right.
One size doesn't fit all.
Yeah. And it kind of brings us back to the fact that we don't all fit in boxes, the fact that we can struggle in very different ways, brings us back to this sort of idea that as we live in communities and we have all these different, colorful humans who are messy, giving ourselves permission to be and giving others permission to be will just allow us to, I think, live fuller and more meaningful lives, richer, versus needing to be a certain way. And because it's so hard, we are, in a way, it's just so hard if you are having a very difficult experience, be it, emotional or physical. It's so hard not to have the feelings that we have, like it's impossible. So creating communities where we start being more open to the sort of lived human experience, which is multifaceted and complex, will hopefully make it easier for us to hold the heavy stuff, like Ben said in our conversation.
Yeah.
That we're in it together. We're all.
And it brings up my favorite definition of resilience, which you've heard many times before, and our listeners have as well, which is struggling well. I get up in the morning. That's my goal for the day. I'm going to struggle well.
And can you unpack that for our listeners? What does struggling well look like?
It means that it's recognizing that life is struggle. I would sometimes tell parents that I worked with, ones that I had a good relationship with, I would say, if having problems is a problem, you have a big problem. Because family life is full of problems. Parents are problem solvers. Your child announces that morning that, oh, by the way, I need to bring in 2 dozen cookies for, my class today. And it's like, no, why didn't you tell me that 2 days ago? Mom's got to deal with that. Dad's got to deal with the broken shoelace, whatever. So life is full of problems, and we can't think of having problems as a problem. And so struggling is part of the deal as a human being. And struggling well just means, I did my best. I didn't shirk from this responsibility. I wasn't perfect. And tomorrow's another day. So it's not beating yourself up because you didn't do things perfectly. And going back to the idea of the to-do list, my to-do list, I scratch 3 things off and put 4 more back on by the end of the day. So it's a never-ending thing. And, we feel like Sisyphus rolling the rock up the hill and it rolls back down again. And if we can accept that's the deal, is the rock, I'm going to roll the rock, it's going to roll back down again, I'm going to roll it up again. It can take the edge off that, this is not right, this is not fair, this is not okay kind of crust that can wrap itself around these situations that doesn't help us at all. Makes us feel worse and probably doesn't allow us to see opportunities that exist to actually do something.
I think that's a tremendous summary of our conversation today. It's wrapped up a lot of what we touched on. You've talked about acceptance,
and
the
change.
Struggle is, and change, right? Yeah. Where can we change? That sort of serenity prayer that they use in AA, grant me the serenity to accept things I cannot change, courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. And that permission to struggle, it's funny, as you were describing this sort of, life as a struggle, I sort of noticed my body relax. Yeah.
I mean, it's so obvious, you just,
it's so obvious.
Getting out of bed in the morning, when the sun doesn't come up till almost 9 o'clock, and here in Seattle, and it's cold and, rainy to boot, it's like just getting out of bed is sometimes a pure act of will.
Yeah, you're right. It seems so obvious, and yet we don't want it to be so. And our effort in trying to not make it so makes it so much harder.
It does, yeah.
So as we wrap up, what's our invitation to our listeners?
To appreciate how messy life is and how it's full of paradoxes and ironies. And maybe we can find some humor in some of this and to not take ourselves quite so seriously and to cut ourselves some slack in terms of not having to be perfect. So self-acceptance, to nurture community, relationships, because that's been a big theme. There was a singer-songwriter named Warren Zevon who died, I think he was in his 40s, several years ago. He had cancer and he knew he was dying. And he was being interviewed once and the interviewer said, "So, how are you approaching death? What words of wisdom do you have?" And he said, "You have to enjoy every sandwich." I think that's good advice. I think we have to enjoy every sandwich. We have to enjoy every encounter we have with our partners and our kids, and friends, family, even when it's not exactly joyful, perhaps.
That's right.
To appreciate, Reed Coucher would say, because, life is hard and everybody's struggling.
Everybody's struggling. That's absolutely true. Wonderful.
Everybody's got their burden to bear. So
They really
cut each
do.
other some slack.
Yeah. So we want to lean more on community, and it's less about self-improvement and more about building communities. And that feels really good to end on that.
Also, to thank all our listeners for their support and curiosity and interest in what we've been doing this last year, which is now, we're finishing up our 3rd year.
It's coming up to our 4th year, 3.5 years. We started in April 3 years ago.
So we appreciate everybody who's downloaded these episodes, and it's very gratifying. It's been a hoot. It's been a lot of fun.
Really has.
And thank you, Emma, for talking me into this. And thank you to all our guests who were willing to, come on and
That's right.
enjoy these conversations. And we're
My
looking forward
goodness.
to some very interesting ones in the coming year. We've got some people lined up for the next 6 months.
My goodness, it's so exciting. Yes.
Some repeats, some, people coming back, as well as a lot of new folks that I think people will find very interesting and inspiring.
I didn't actually expect, one of the things that this Lifestyle Little Secrets podcast has taught me has allowed me to really see the generosity that people are so tremendously generous with their time, with their knowledge, with their care. I felt really blessed to have so many fantastic guests that have come and given us their time and their knowledge, and it feels like a real active community. Smart,
accomplished.
That's
wow.
right.
Yeah, it's been amazing.
It's been amazing. Very humbling. And we've built our little community here. Very special. So thank you. And thank you, Chris, for coming on the ride. I wouldn't do it without you.
You're very welcome. Here's to 2026.
That's right. Thank you all.